classes this afternoon. Both classes will be open for anybody who's interested to come and attend. In J1 at 1 o'clock, a sociology course and a psychology course will be meeting together. And then at 2 o'clock in the library conference room, we'll have another opportunity to come and interact with Dr. Yoder. I'd also like to remind you that tomorrow at 11 o'clock in the Johnson Lounge, students are encouraged to come and interact with Dr. Yoder. And then at noon, at 12 o'clock noon, eat lunch with him also. It's my pleasure at this time to introduce to you Dr. Yoder. I'd like to share very briefly my own gradual introduction to him over the past few years. I first heard Dr. Yoder's name back in 1974 when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Fuller Graduate School of Psychology. And one of the books that was making the rounds there was Politics of Jesus. And I read that book amongst a whole bunch of other books. And it was one of the most significant things I had read up until that point, and it was the most significant book I read while I was there. And then the first time, a couple years ago, when I was asked to go down to Goshen College in Indiana to give a presentation, the whole thing was new to me. And so I asked the woman who was introducing me to the group if she happened to know John Howard Yoder. Or I think I said John Yoder. Of course, everybody laughed. I didn't know what I was done, but apparently in Mennonite circles, everybody's name here. So she wanted to know which John Yoder you're talking about. Then, more recently, her mutual friend, Al Dewey, another psychologist who teaches out on the West Coast, I've been exposed to many more of Dr. Yoder's writings, in particular his critique of Bieber's Christ and Culture, which has really fascinated me. So I feel very privileged at this time, and I think we all are, to have an opportunity to meet Dr. Yoder in person. He represents to me God's challenge to understand our heritage in the full gospel and to live it out in obedience to Him as we join hands as disciples of Jesus to further His kingdom. Let's give Dr. John Howard Yoder a good hand.
I'm very grateful for this opportunity to visit this campus. I'd like to spend more time, if I didn't have your assignment, explaining something of my respect for the tradition and witness represented by the denomination of the school. That would distract from my theme for right now. Already too much to deal with in the time we have. There's more than one understanding of what it means to be a village. For some people, it means to hold to certain truths. For others, it means to support certain activities, especially evangelism. The definition like that sometimes means that we need only to defend what has already been adequately defined. We have it made, and we just hold to that. But there is another understanding of what it means to let the gospel be at work in our lives. And that is to recognize that we are never done letting our lives and our understanding be changed by the meaning of the work of Christ. John Calvin is credited with the phrase, Ecclesia Reformata Semper Reformanda, meaning the church once reformed still is always in need of being reformed. The man named Robinson, who preached a farewell sermon to the people who, when they got to America, came to be called the Mountain Fathers, the Pilgrims, said, "The Lord has yet much more light and truth to break forth from His holy word." They've been having a Reformation in England by that time for most of a century. His point was, we're still not done being changed by the gospel. That's the point that I think we have to make as we look to the scriptural instructions on the matters of God's care for the poor. This is not a realm in which we have solved our problem, or in which we have it made. I'm not defending here a denominational position, although some reference has been made to my denominational background. That's shared by my friend and former student, Myron Osberg, who was also here this week. I'm not talking about a contemporary to know what we still need to be shaken and moved by with regard to the bias of the God of the Bible in favor of the poor. First, a few readings which I will not interpret in detail, but just repeat so that we can understand something of the strength and clarity of this witness from the founding generation of our movement. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like the flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass, its flower falls and its beauty perishes, so will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. My brethren, show no partiality as you hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man with gold rings and in fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, "Have a seat here, please," while you say to the poor man, "Stand there," or "Sit at my feet," have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brethren, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. It is not the rich who oppress you. It is not they who drag you into court. It is not they who blaspheme that honorable name by which you are called. If you really fulfill the royal law, according to the Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You do well. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law and its transgressions. Come now, you who say, "Today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and pray and get gain," whereas you do not know about tomorrow. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, "If the Lord wills, we shall live, and we shall do this or that." As it is, you boast in your characters. Come now, you rich, eat and howl for the misery You shall rejoice in your peace, you and your son and your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, the Levite, the sojourner, fatherless, and the widow who are in your towns. The poor are always part of the celebration, as part of the description. No interest on loans is a principle repeatedly stated. Security on a loan should not be of such a kind as to jeopardize the honor of the person who gives security. The person who makes a loan shouldn't go into the home of the person who will be lent to do something that is good. Piece of security, the employees pay every day if they need it. The basic needs of outsiders are referred to, not as charity, not as goodness, but as justice. You shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner of the father, or take a widow's garment in pledge. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I commend you to do this, command you to do this. And the next passage is the rights of leaders to have their share of the harvest. This is not ideal. It's not a utopia. It's not a vision for a better society. This is a description of how, according to the law of Moses, people could actually run a society. It didn't have to be enforced by government, nor was it an appeal to the goodwill of individuals. It was the moral duty of every faithful Israelite to be sure that no one was suffering material need within their borders. I refer to legislation because that's where we usually look at the Old Testament. The other part of the Old Testament that is very similar in its impact and its stronger in its language is the Prophets. And we'll talk about that all. We have a very good summary of that available in the book by Ron Snyder, who's a Christian in the name of Hunter, where again it's very clear that the concern is the same in another age of the Old Testament. But the question for us is not what the Scripture says, because what the Scripture says is clear. The problem for us is that we avoid listening to it. We have developed patterns of avoidance. So I need to move not to what the Scripture says about God being on the second board, that's clear, but why it is that we have for centuries, and in special ways in our culture, developed patterns of not believing that, or not acting it out. And I'll do that by three people looking at other themes which have to do with the social faith of the church, and how Christians all look when they're together. Some of the themes on fact, teaching, and other connections, where we have regularly backed away from being as original or as different as the gospel says we ought to be. Well, these are not about food. These are something else about the lives of the church. But there are places, again, where we have patterns of not doing what it says. There are three major texts in the writings of Paul that say that every member of the Christian community has to give, because of the work of the Holy Spirit, because of the generosity of Christ. We have watered that down to say a few people ought to help the pastor. Or in a large church, you may have a team ministry where there's more than one religious leader. Or that it would be nice if you took your secular vocation seriously. So if you are in merchandising or education, that ought to be done in a Christian way. Those things are all true, but that's not what the gospel meant to say about everyone having to give to the church. We still have a spectator form of church. We still have a performer understanding of the Christian ministry. for whom the people have to be thought of, or has to be thought of, that term, the people, as the especially virtuous element in the society, where there are folklore enthusiasts, for whom the specific culture of people who happen to be poor is an especially valuable culture. And that's also true. There are some special values in the American experience in the folk culture of the economy. And there's some special moral values in the folk culture of the original Americans. Several of the tribal cultures having been especially much more effective than ours in responsibility and living together in peace. There are some special social values in the folk culture of the American Black experience. There are such values. Some of them are connected, in fact, with being able to live poor and to hold the culture together when you don't have power and money. Some of them help survive. Some of them are not connected to poverty, but have a value in their own right. But the reason God is on the side of the poor is not their culture's morality. Not that they have more solid family life, or extended family solidarity, or more patience, or more ability to occupy themselves in kind of unemployment without having resources. Not all the poor have such cultural strength. Before we saw on the slide, some of the third world or the refugee camps might not be able to survive better because of the social values their culture has. And not all those strengths will remain if they cease to be poor, if they rise socially once they are healthy. No, the reason God is on the side of the poor is not that they have virtues. Not because if they had a chance they would make it. Not because they are intrinsically less selfish than Christians. Some of them, but not all. Not because they wouldn't be more able to use wealth and power if they had it. Some, but not all. The reason God is on the side of the poor is that He is a gracious God. In our thinking that God has to have a reason to be gracious, or that we would need to root the claims of the poor upon us in some value and virtue of the culture of property is the reason in terms of the law and merit and not in terms of grace. It's not enough to say that in addition to what the state of God must help some. It isn't enough as to say that once we have heard the gospel, then we will care about the needy. The gospel is the fact God cares about the needy. God became human in Jesus. We are brothers and sisters in the human community which He created through the work of Christ. Mammon is an idol, the only idol in Jesus' name, by name, from whose worship we are free. So that the call to freedom from being possessed by our possessions and generosity is a call to be a part of the work of God's grace in the world. Now we're ready to look in the last minute at the story of the rich young ruler. I don't need to read it because we've read it before, but which is a particular focus of our patterns of avoidance. We misread it partly because we aren't as Jewish as the first readers of this text were. This man asked Jesus what he would have to do to inherit eternal life. Jesus starts putting down the list of the Ten Commandments. And the man says, all of these I have observed, what do I still lack? And we take it as if Jesus had spoken a list of all the Ten Commandments. If I were one of the poor to whom he didn't give it, it wouldn't have done me much good that he was less active with money than the poor. I, as one of the poor, would to help. Another kind of way that we avoid the thrust of discussion is to ask whether it worked. And I can ask that on several levels. If the act which is asked of this young man were to be translated immediately into a legal system, into a social system, and everybody always had to do it, there were laws that made everybody always have to do what he's supposed to do, would that be a good society? What socialism would be a better society than one of the personal property? That's one way to write that. The other is to ask if the society doesn't, but if this young man had actually shared his property, would it have done much good for the poor of Palestine? Would the people he would have helped been helped much once they would have finished consuming the small amount that it would have been for every individual he had given all his wages to people? After all, those were not good for us. Those are good questions for us to ask if we are concerned with contemporary social strategy and with time and with numbers and distance and biblical effort in trying to work out the details of our faith. But they are not good questions. When we use them as a barrier to understanding what Jesus was talking about for that owner of property. For him, the call of faithfulness for all of God was to share that property in order to impart Jesus' movement, which was, among other things, a movement of sharing the property. Jesus knew all of the, he knew at least he could think about all of the objections that I just mentioned. He couldn't make a social strategy out of it, but it couldn't feed everybody. Humanly speaking, Jesus must not have been that unintelligent as not to have thought of those things. So that when he said this to the young man, he didn't say something that we can ward off because we think he didn't think of that. Jesus wasn't asking whether it would change the world for this young man. The better way to put this question is whether the young man would be acting on the basis of the world being different because Jesus was there. That's what Christians are supposed to believe. That in the presence of Jesus among us, that God himself made himself for among us for our salvation. The world is already different. Already in his physical presence, we call incarnation. And all the Lord has that with itself out with the culmination of the spread of so much cross, resurrection, and ascension, Pentecost. The last way we try to avoid the impact of this text on us is what might be called backhanded legalism. We say, as I said in the next paragraph, if that's the rule, who can ever get it? Of course, not many could. But Jesus knew when he assumed that his disciples would sometimes not understand that nobody gets in by keeping the rule. And even nobody gets in by keeping special rules that are ordinary for this person and for others, usually fast. No, we don't get in by rules. We get in by miracles. We get into the kingdom by grace. We get into the kingdom because God stops asking whether we have the right to be in. The question for our teacher is not what rules we have to keep to get in. So that's the way we ask. The question is, if it is true that the kingdom is among us in Jesus, then how are we going to behave? Now, we all know there are social science arguments against anarchistic communism and against totalitarian communism. But that isn't our theme. God became poor for Jesus. Jesus left his home and his profession. His disciples left their oaths and their vows and their vests. They shared at one table, lived from one purse, already doing it during the earthly ministry and prolonging it in the story of Acts. That sharing is the meaning of the Lord's Supper, among other things. That sharing is, among other things, the meaning of claiming that God is Jesus, Christian doctrine of the incarnation. If we don't see how that frees us to share in our time by giving up our goods to the poor, whatever pattern structure for fitting our world for doing that, then we aren't seeing Jesus as good news. If we filter that call through our common sense, through our doubts about management, through our skepticism about other contemporary social idealisms, if we let our common sense keep us from finding our own ways to be sharers of the gift of God to the poor, then we have Jesus as good news. The question is whether we see it as law. The young man who saw it as law and he made away with sad. He saw it as bad. If we follow Jesus, we see him as good news. And then we must believe, even if we don't know how to get out there, even if we haven't worked through what it means for our time, even if we haven't been evangelically renewed all this time, through an empowered with the power of God, we need to see it as the promise and the call of God for our restoration, not to purpose or to crush us, but to invite us to be involved in what God is to unite. Ever since Leviticus, ever since Deuteronomy, ever since Jeremiah, ever since Jesus, when God takes the side of the needy, not because of their virtues, not because of the good they're going to do, but just because He's that kind of God. Our word for that is grace. And if we have governed, our word for that is gospel. Go to prayer. Father, we confess each of us is still in some way rich. Each of us can say we have kept some of the law. We have kept much, some of the law. You remind us of the legislation, the ancient scriptures of the Hebrews, the call of the prophets, the words of the mouth of Jesus, of the rest of the law, the rest of the call of heaven. Among those who accept the gift of being your people, there are to be none that go in their heart and their need. As in every age, the gospel has worked to change hearts and minds and souls. So in our age of growing awareness of the evils of poverty, the threats to the world's economic resources, we ask for a renewing by the good news of our ability to make the gospel work in our time.
One of the teachers.
Started. I have a introductory announcement for the members of my class. Tomorrow is the test at 2 o'clock. I won't be here because Hans Kuhn is speaking at the University of Chicago tomorrow, I think at 3 o'clock, on the role of religion in society today, so I thought that sounded relevant. So I won't be here. Now, if you want to go to that speech also, I can take the test next Monday, because I think it'd be a good opportunity if you want to go hear that speech. So if you do want to see me in class, to the test office for that. Okay, today, those of you that were in chapel know that our speaker is John Howard Yoder, and I have one anecdote. What was the name of that college you went to?
Goshen.
No, it wasn't Goshen.
That I went to?
Last year, the group of us in Trinity.
Oh, Bethel, in
Bethel,
Newton,
yeah.
Kansas.
Yeah.
Right.
A group of faculty from Trinity, about 7 or 8 of us, went to Bethel College in Newton, Kansas last year. And in an attempt to make conversation at dinner, I asked the group what was the best book they'd ever read that was written by an evangelical, contemporary. Or could they think of some good books that they read by contemporary evangelicals? And of the lot, of 7 or 8, none of them could think of any good books except one by John Howard Yoder, Politics of Jesus. That was the only one that had that arose in conversation. Okay, we're going to start out by asking him to speak a little bit about the distinctness of the Anabaptist tradition. And then I know Kirk also has a question after that.
I won't start with the definition because the definition is part of what grows out of the rest of the study. This being part of this group being a sociology class, the adjective Anabaptist has come in the last 2 generations to be a label for a specific type of church organization, regardless of who has it. That is, regardless of where the historical origins of a group are. And in that sense, there would be people who would say that the Evangelical Free Church is an Anabaptist type church, as contrasted with the Presbyterians or the Lutherans. That's the sociological use of the word, which is only current since this century. But before you see why that makes sense, I'll have to go back through the earlier history. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century had a number of different independent streams. They were all together in that they weren't Catholic anymore, but they varied considerably in how they went about no longer being Catholic. We have a very refined picture of Europe. The Rhine runs from Switzerland, which wasn't really united that much, but is in the heart of Western Europe that way, down through the Netherlands, and over here were the German territories ruled by princes where Martin Luther was. Luther's sociology was that he was a theologian who got the support of a prince. Those princes were ruling countries that were not democratic, but late feudal systems. Teacher can tell you what feudal means. And a prince would authorize a theologian to set the theology for that province, and then in that province, from then on, they would all be Lutherans. The university would have to teach people Lutheran truth, and the prince would put Lutheran graduates in the parishes, and therefore it was a Lutheran country. So that's establishment in the simple sense that the theology is determined by the prince. In the Upper Rhine Valley, Strasbourg, Basel, Zurich being the main cities, but also Nuremberg and Augsburg, there was a different social pattern. By this time there was a kind of early democracy based on the guilds. The guilds were trade unions. All of the tanners and all of the carpenters and all of the shoemakers would get together, and then these trade groups or guilds
would send representatives into a city council. It was a kind of democracy, although it wasn't based on universal suffrage. And each of these cities was a relatively independent city-state. They had some obligations to the Holy Roman Empire, which covered the whole area, but was very loosely governed. And many of their local activities could be determined locally. And it happened in each of those cities that a local theologian was authorized by the city council to dominate the Reformation and to teach gradually what it is about Roman Catholic tradition that they set aside. And these are the areas that finally turned out to be reformed. The theologian who had the most to do with finally developing Reformed theology was Calvin, who came in the second generation to the city of Geneva, which is now the corner of Switzerland. But the movement was going on before. And here I have to get beyond just formal descriptions and names because we'll come back to it. In the city of Zurich, the main thinker of the first generation was a man named Zwingli, whom you should never have heard about unless you took a Reformation course. But he had the backing of the city council of Zurich. That pattern, where a local city has its own Reformation under the guidance of a locally mandated theologian, finally turned out the Reformed tradition, which took over these territories, and then a little in Hesse, and finally in Hungary, and especially the Netherlands, and then Scotland. When it comes from Scotland, we call it Presbyterian. When it comes from anywhere else, we call it Reformed. That's the second form of Reformation, based in local democratic structure, and providing also a somewhat more democratic form of church structure. The third kind of Protestant Reformation was the Anglican kind, where it was the king, simply, who said, I'm no longer under Rome, and made himself the head of the church. These three kinds of Protestantism have in common that they base the Reformation on the authority of the government. And the government says we may have a Reformation, and authorizes a theologian to say what it means, and gradually adjust the church practices and the doctrines according to that theologian's guidance. But the government remains in charge. All of the people in the province hold to the same view. They must all become Reformed or Lutheran or Anglican. The nation itself is seen as a Christian nation. There is no change from the Middle Ages in all of those respects. That finally became settled, that connection to the state, in a legal phrase. It was only written up later, which was part of the law of the time, and because it kind of rhymes, it is often remembered. Whose region it is, but that also means rule. Whoever rules, his shall be the religion. So that means if your prince is a Lutheran, you're all Lutherans in the whole province. If the prince accepts Calvinism, then you're all Reformed. If your prince is the King of England, then you're all Episcopalians. That was the basic settlement. But there did happen something else in the 16th century, which was an exception to that. And that's where we move into our subject matter, but we can only see it when we start from here. As Ulrich Zwingli was developing his movement in the 1520s, he got some ideas that called into question the idea of establishment. And his idea of Christian faith was such that it wasn't sure that everybody would have Christian faith. Well, then, should everybody be considered as a Christian? They are this way with the church-state connection. Well, he started saying that Christian faith is a kind of personal importance and validity, that not everybody is a believer, and only an adult can be a believer, really. Well, then why do you baptize babies? Well, the issue of infant baptism, therefore, became an issue that called this whole business into question. Because if you don't baptize babies, then not everybody will be your kind of Christian. So the state's control over the faith was one issue. The baptism of infants was another issue. There were more, but for our purposes, if we're talking general sociology, that's enough. To notice that if you call into question infant baptism, then the membership of the church will no longer be the same as the membership of the province. But you will have some people belonging to the church voluntarily because they ask for baptism as adults, and other people who then wouldn't be members of the church. And that was a radical idea in the 16th century. Also, the idea that the government shouldn't reform the church was a radical idea. All of the major Protestant groups believed it. But some of Zwingli's radical young disciples
came to believe that wasn't true. Because if you wait for your local government to be in favor of reforming the church, that means that you're not doing the will of God at his own pace, but you're waiting for government to decide. The way it finally broke through was that there were discussions in Zurich in the 1523-24 period about how to go through certain steps. It happened to be when we'll start practicing the Lord's Supper instead of the Catholic Mass. Zwingli said we should no longer be celebrating the Catholic Mass with its traditional meanings. We should be celebrating a Protestant Lord's Supper. But we won't implement that until the City Council authorizes it. And he waited a year and a half, during which time he kept on celebrating the Catholic Mass while he was preaching it was wrong, because the government wouldn't authorize him to change. Well, there's some people who said if we know it's wrong, we shouldn't let the government impose on us disobedience to what we know of the gospel. So they started arguing for a practice of the Lord's Supper. That was the final breaking point in the first debates in the last months of 1523. Out of that, there developed a gradual growth of the dissenting movement, which finally became independent enough that in January 1525, there first came into being cells of people who asked to be baptized as adults on confession of faith. And from then on, there were communities of these kinds of people. They were called Anabaptists because the Greek prefix ana means again. So that just means rebaptizers. That's the formal origin of the word. They, of course, didn't believe that they were rebaptizing anybody because they didn't believe anymore that when a priest sprinkled some water on a Catholic baby, that was baptism. So for them, this was the proper baptism, but for the authorities, this was rebaptism. And that was the formal reproach against which could be used to say why they were criminals, because it was in the old Roman legal codes that it was wrong to rebaptize. That was because of some conflicts in the early Roman Catholic tradition in the 4th and 5th centuries. So if you call these people Anabaptists, that makes them criminals, and they can be dealt with as criminals by the civil authorities. That movement went down the Rhine and along the Alps a little. In the 16th century, there were several thousands of these people, although not enormous crowds. There were several hundreds, if not thousands, of martyrs under both Catholic and Protestant governments. So the technical historical meaning of the word Anabaptist is the term that the historians used for that movement, which made its identity out of issues that are sociological character. That is, who's a member of the church? Well, only adult believers. How is the church structured? Only by the meetings of its members and not by the government. And thirdly, how do these people behave? Well, in addition to what I mentioned, they differed with regard to the ethics of government. They were nonviolent, or in modern language we would say pacifists. They rejected the rightness of wielding the sword for Christians on the basis of a simple reading of the New Testament. So those three marks are the ones that are most fundamental. Freedom from government administration, adult baptism, and rejection of violence. And those are all sociological questions. Notice they don't have special ideas on predestination or Trinity or any of the classic doctrinal questions that Christians have scolded each other about in other periods. Now, those people were 16th century. In the 17th century, similar things happened, although I can't go into detail, so that the Baptists came from England in the 17th century, around 1650, with relatively similar convictions, except on the matter of violence and the sword. Most Baptists are non-violent, but with regard to other questions, the Baptists and these people agree. Then there have been many other groups since then that have again come to the same position. The Plymouth Brethren and the Disciples in the 19th century. Many other groups have come to hold to some or most of the same positions. So that now a church historian will use the word Anabaptist with a small a as a type of church. You have the established Protestant type. There's Anglican, Presbyterian, Lutheran. And then you have the free Protestant type, or the Anabaptist type, which is made up of adult believers and not governed by the state authorities, but only by the congregations themselves. So much for origins and description. Now you tell me what it takes more to make that connect with where you've been. Descendants of all these people came to North America.
the people in this group that went to Moravia in East Central Europe, in their experience of persecution, got into a position where they pooled their goods in order to survive together, and have since been living in communes. The man who led that was a man named Yoder, and the descendants of that movement still exist in the prairie provinces of Canada and the American states, northwestern states. They're called Yoderite or Lucarian Brethren. Most of the other people from this background who came to North America are called Mennonites. That's from the 16th century. Of course, from the 17th century, they're called Baptists. And it's a much larger movement, much more in the middle of American frontier experience. So the heirs of all these people are still in North America. So we have the word as a 16th century phenomenon. We have the word as a type by historians to describe as well Baptists and disciples. We have the word in its use by sociologists to describe any group that is constituted by the free membership of adult believers in local groups.
Sociologically, how vital do you think that baptism is for the church now? Has the sociology of the that the church finds itself in removed? Like, people were being killed for rebaptizing at one point in history. Certainly they're not now. And so from what standpoint do people even hold baptism in the same sense as they once did?
You know, you're right. The meaning has clearly changed. A young person growing up in a village in Georgia dominated by 3 Southern Baptist churches has no real choice about whether to be baptized, even if it happens to be 10 or 15. So the meaning is not at all what it was back then. And that's quite right, that the practice of water baptism in a situation where it is not separated from establishment and not a matter of a radical personal commitment to be against the stream of the world has given the practice of baptism a different meaning. That doesn't mean that it makes it right to baptize babies theologically, and it doesn't mean that proper church life wouldn't still make an issue of baptism, but it does mean that it has nothing of the same dramatic depth as an issue in the turning point in people's lives that it had in the 16th century. So it has the same formal meaning that the congregation is still formed out of people who made an adult commitment. But that adult commitment is much less costly than it used to be. Sometimes it's even the other way around, that there are inducements to make that adult commitment from the wider society. You're more likely to be elected president if you're born again and baptized than if you're a Jew or a Catholic. So there are all kinds of, and you can sell more of your goods in the Christian Yellow Pages, whatever else it takes. So the dramatic countercultural meaning of baptism for these people is not reproduced by baptism in our day. It might be something else. It might be the Jehovah's Witnesses' position on saluting the flag, or some other minority stance in our time might have a little of that same meaning. Baptism itself doesn't anymore.
So in a sense, and theologically, what the Lutherans and the Catholics do is doing nothing from an Anabaptist tradition. If they're not, because the government considered them Anabaptist, rebaptizing, but you said that they considered themselves simply baptizing for the first time. Is a meaningless sprinkling? Is that what Lutherans and Catholics participated?
The Anabaptists then said, well, that's just a meaningless ceremony, or even if it's a counterproductive ceremony because it says the wrong thing to the parents and the child. It says now this person is a Christian when it isn't meaningful to say that they're a Christian. So it's not just nothing, it's counterproductive. But it certainly isn't, it doesn't make of that baptized one a Christian. So it's a ceremony, and it's a ceremony that actually communicates a negative understanding of what it means to be Christian. Because it says your parents can make you Christian.
So they would, the Anabaptist tradition would say the same thing now then too. They look at a Lutheran church baptizing infants and say,
well, they'd still say it's the wrong thing to do. They might be less critical of whether an adult who stays in the Lutheran church and of course of growing up is confirmed or makes an adult commitment or has a personal experience. They wouldn't say those persons aren't Christian. They just say that the pattern in which the baptism was practiced wasn't the best. It wouldn't deny that they're Christian.
Anybody else have a question about this?
one of the things, John, that our class in psychology is dealing with, and I'd like to set this up because maybe some of the students would like to ask questions on this, is dealing with that Niebuhr book, Christ and Culture, and those 5 categories. And we're trying to bring together the secular and the sacred and those kinds of splits. And it's really difficult to think about how it is that Christ has an impact in a society. What size should it be? How should it be done? How should people congregate? What kind of strategies and that sort of thing. And I'd like to ask if there are students here that have some questions coming from either your critique, which I'm assuming they've all read. I have that over in the library for them to read, so some of them will have read your critique of Niebuhr already, or his book. I wonder if any of you have any questions about that you'd like to ask him, since he's right here right now.
The students in the sociology class wouldn't have read that book.
Not necessarily.
Could you tell me how you specifically define your definition of culture as opposed to Niebuhr's definition of culture?
Does everybody know why that's a question? Because part of the difficulty of plugging in with this in the middle is that there's so much prior definition involved in seeing why it's a problem. So I probably better play back a little of that discussion first. Niebuhr means by culture almost everything. There's a passage in the book that actually says that. Everything that people do in an organized way together is culture. So it doesn't only mean arts and liberal arts. It also means work and organization, political organization, economic organization, education, family. Culture is everything about organized life together. And then the question is, if Jesus makes you a difference, what difference does he make to that? There are 5 answers, according to Niebuhr, that he finds taken typically in the history of Christian thought in the West, and runs those type answers through the centuries, beginning in the New Testament itself. You can say that Jesus is against culture, simply counter, or you can say that he is simply for, and this would mean a fusion of the value of Jesus and everything else. That is, all human wisdom is the same. Jesus is a phenomenon within human wisdom, but not different from everything else. So if you get wisdom somewhere else, in philosophy or the insight of the Gnostics in the first century Near East, that's all the same. All truth is the same. Jesus is just part of it. That's the second. The alternative to that is to be negative. Church against the world. Jesus calling people away from their occupations. These are both in the Bible, although this is more strongly in the New Testament. That's barely in the edge of the New Testament, and in fact is denounced in the New Testament as heresy, as Niebuhr reports it from the writings, the letters of John. But those 2 extremes are too simple. So next you need to have 2 ways of being less simple. Christ above culture means that you take this wisdom, but you don't let it be sovereign. You put on top of it something that comes only from Jesus. That's the Catholic medieval system, where you accept the philosophy of the Greeks and the political thought of the Romans and the family patterns of whichever culture you're in, whether they're Germanic or Spanish or whatever. But then you have the Christian virtues on top of that, and Christian language, Christian insight on top of it. That's the Catholic synthesis. It's possible to see them in a tension with each other, that this negative element is there and the positive element is there, and the connection between them is not resolved but continues to kind of zigzag. That he sees as the Lutheran element expressed in the theology of law and gospel, that on the one side we are condemned, and on the other side we are forgiven, and the condemnation and forgiveness both have to do with culture, which is both wrong and accepted. And then the right answer takes all this wisdom the best of everything and puts it together, and that's called Christ transforming culture, which is Niebuhr's own position, and is described in such general terms that all the readers of the book think it's the right answer. Now, I have two kinds of formal critiques of that book. One is that the construction of the types is not fair to the phenomena it's supposed to describe, and that's especially something that I can say of this view because it's used to put in that category the Anabaptists and Leo Tolstoy and St. Francis and a lot of other people who made much of the model of Jesus, but who I don't think are countercultural the way he says they are. The second is that his description of this, as I just said, is so vague and uncritical and positive that nobody could not want to be doing that. Paul Ramsey, who teaches ethics at Princeton University, commented a long time ago that when he took a very mixed class through that book, everybody from Catholic to evangelical wanted to transform society, regardless of what their theology was. So it's a skewed way to set up a set of types. Now, how does that come back to the question? To say that Christ is anti-cultural presupposes a certain definition of culture. But Niebuhr's definition is so broad that you can't possibly be against it, because it includes everything. He doesn't discriminate within what is culture. He doesn't permit discriminating between good and bad elements. So the first thing that I would say now after this wind-up to the question is that an understanding of culture that's going to be ethically serious cannot assume, as Niebuhr does, that you must, in order to be consistent, always take the same position with regard to all elements of it. Now, the word I use for that critique is that he makes it monolithic. And as if you had to say with regard to agriculture the same thing that you say with regard to university education, that you say with regard to military establishment, that all of those elements of culture must be, you must accept them all, or reject them all, or synthesis them all, or paradox them all, or transform them all in the same way, as if culture were such a solid reality that the only honest thing to do is to take the same posture with regard to every element of it. Well, then my alternative is to say, no, we must be discriminating. There are some elements of culture about which we will be very affirmative, like the family, or agricultural productivity. And there are other elements about which we will be very negative, like pornography or the arms race. And there are other elements about which we will be discriminatingly affirmative, like the social organization of the welfare state, or organized transportation as a way to meet human need. Niebuhr's structure militates against being discriminating. Now, my structure would militate for being discriminating and saying within the various things that you can call culture, which ones are useful and which ones aren't, and deciding that not on a global basis, as he wants us to do, but on a piecemeal basis, depending on the cases. The best example of his, well, there are two good examples of his being monolithic, to use the term I use. One of them is Tertullian, a Christian thinker of about 180 to 100 AD, who was one of the great minds behind the development of Christian theological debate on such profound matters as the Trinity, but who also was a pacifist and was against Christian participation in anything the Roman government did because of its persecuting Christians and being idolatrous. Well, obviously, if you're pacifist and against Roman idolatry, you are countercultural. And yet Tertullian used good Latin. See, he cheats, Niebuhr says. He's inconsistent because he uses the language, which is culture, and he's against the war, which is culture. So he's inconsistent. That's only inconsistent if the word culture is monolithically defined. It's not inconsistent at all if you have more discriminating definitions of what it means to make moral judgments. Similarly, he says, there's only one sentence on the Mennonites in the whole book, and it actually describes a certain subgroup of the Mennonites, not most Mennonites. He says they are so against culture that they have their own schools. Well, Calvinists have their own schools. The Evangelical Free Church has its own schools. That doesn't mean you're against culture. It means you want your culture to be under the guidance of your faith. Well, the Amish have their own schools because they don't want their children to go to secular high schools. So they do have a sense of distance, but not because they're against culture. Because they want a Christian culture as they see it, rather than a pagan culture as they see it being promoted by the city schools they don't want their children to go to. So again, there's a fundamental logical flaw. I'm not saying that Niebuhr's ethics is wrong. I'm saying that he has misinterpreted the lay of the land with regard to the phenomena he's trying to describe, and thereby can't be fair to the facts, since he's using a screen that keeps him from seeing the discrimination that the people are using that he's trying to talk about. So what would my definition of culture be? Well, then, I would still agree that you can call culture anything that people do together, but that the Christian business is to discriminate morally on biblical and other grounds which of the elements of that cultural reality can be used by Christians wholeheartedly, which can be used discriminatingly, and which they should disavow, disown, or fight against. And it's all culture.
So in a sense, what you're taking, you're agreeing in a sense with Niebuhr, but you say we should be more discriminative.
If you want to use the word culture to say everything, well, I can agree with that.
Okay, but you're saying it's more
But he
monolithic.
says, to be honest, then you have to deal with it all the same way, and I say, no, you must deal with all the elements differently. Every element of culture must be looked at for its own sake, not just because it's part of culture with a big C.
So you would say then, it's sort of like how Niebuhr's saying transformation of culture is like, if we say we're going against transformation of culture, is like going against mom, apple pie, and Chevrolet.
You know, I'm in favor of transformation too. In fact, I know better than Niebuhr what transformation means because I have criteria by which to know. And he doesn't explain how to transform culture. He just quotes some recent modern thinkers that he thinks are wise, but he doesn't say why the transformation he's interested in is a Christian transformation. Whereas if I take the reality of Jesus and I say much more solid things about what that reality of Jesus meant, then I can use the reality of Jesus to do this discriminating up here and say that Christian transformation of culture is going on in those places where the creativity of people who take their signals from Jesus makes it possible to live together in a better way. And that's transforming culture. So when William Penn ran the best colony in the colonial period in the States because he dealt with the Indians as human beings, he was taking the phenomenon of colonization, which was there, and transforming it through the impact of Christ. Or Roger Williams setting up the first state in which there was explicit commitment to freedom of religion. They were taking a cultural phenomenon and some element of what they got from Jesus permitted them to transform it. So it's still transformation, but it's critical transformation. Whereas the way Niebuhr comes to it, we can't quite see from the book what his criteria are for transformation.
Wouldn't Niebuhr maybe say, well, I didn't put the criteria in for transformation because it's up to the individual to make his own criteria for transformation. I think that at the end of, especially as,
Yeah, the concluding chapter kind of says everybody's right.
and it's sort of saying, well, it's up to the person, the individual, or the community in which the person lives in to make that transformation, and I cannot say put the criteria in myself because in a sense I'm imposing where I might be wrong. In a sense I have to leave it open-ended.
That sounds gentle and modest, but it actually means that the category becomes meaningless. Because defining the category is just another word for leaving it to everybody, so all these positions could also do that. But I'd say more deeply that he didn't really believe that. If a Nazi would have come along and said, well, we like to kill Jews, that's going to be the transformation of culture that we're committed to. The logic you just quoted couldn't have stopped him. Of course, he didn't prove that. So there was more to what he said, but you're right, there is an element of profound relativism in the last chapter. As if any position is right, and therefore the most right position is just the one that has them all combined. But I don't think he would have deeply believed that if you'd taken it out to the logical conclusion.
Well, I would have thought that, but maybe more of what he's saying is, yes, there is scriptural criteria per se, okay, but how we interpret scripture, in a sense, he doesn't want to, in a sense, he wants to, in a more of a sense, he doesn't want to give it the how to transform culture, but here is an option in a way to transform culture. You see how I'm playing with that there, how I'm running with that. He doesn't want to give you a how to do it, but in a sense, here is an option you can use, okay?
No, so-
he says we should go by scriptural criteria, but it's up to you, in a sense, to make it.
Well, I don't think he'd even say scriptural criteria. That's more biblical language, or more traditional language than he would make a point of. He would think you get your criteria from all over the place. Reason, common sense, Aristotle, Plato, and the Roman law, and all kinds of other places, not just from Scripture. But you will meld them together in a way that uses all of the elements from everywhere, and ultimately the individual or the individual group is its own boss. Christ is not Lord in any domineering sense, that's clear. But I don't think that he would, well, I said that before, that I don't think he'd really be as relativist as he sounds. But neither would he be as scriptural as you want him to sound, as if some particular major biblical thrust would automatically be accepted because it's there in the Bible. He was much more in the age when people decided the Bible doesn't say anything for clear because you can understand it in so many different ways. The Bible's a wax nose. Some classic phrases used for that, can bend it almost anyway. And therefore it doesn't help. So you have a relativism based on the fact that Scripture is not clear and modern situations are different and everybody's interpretation is biased. So let's just try to be nice to each other and tolerant. And the most true position will be the one that mixes the most. And that he does say in his concluding chapter. A friend of mine who teaches ethics in Southern Baptist Seminary did a dissertation with Niebuhr and discovered that the different chapters were not written all at the same time. And that there was a period in his life, teaching life, when he really was a relativist like that and believed that there is no right position. And there were other times when he believed there was a right position. And you can do stratigraphic analysis of the different parts of the book, depending on how sure they are of one right position. That gets beyond what we can do here. But Richard Niebuhr was a morally committed person. He didn't really believe in relativism. But at certain times, he thought the best thing to do in America is just make sure everybody is tolerant with all the rest. And we don't have a right position. I grant that's an ecumenical stance that is respectable to take in America in the 1940s. But that it doesn't help us much to know what it would really mean if Christ were to transform culture in any other way than just taking that phrase as a slogan, an apple pie type slogan, that nobody could be against.
In your critique against culture, you put yourself, I guess, in the sense that he didn't give that. You were saying this before, that he didn't give a full definition. Maybe could you expand on how you would see the against culture more? I mean, placing maybe yourself into a category.
Well, my category is transformation. That's the right answer. But in my transformation, I would take more seriously than he does the claim that in Jesus and the New Testament, there is substantial information that is not rubbery or wax or subject to utterly arbitrary variations of whoever reads it differently. But that if you read the text more carefully, you can find out more clearly that there's some things that Jesus and the apostles and the prophets are in favor of that have to do with culture, like the things that I'm talking about in my lectures. Loving the enemy and sharing your bread, those are cultural phenomena. The Bible calls for them. So those substantial criteria are bigger, so that'd be the main thing that stay first, I think, that there is an affirmation that is cultural of the people of God as a different way to live. It's against the way the world lives, and in that sense, against still fits, but it is a culture because it's a different way to live. Something to do with bread and something to do with membership and something to do with enemies. This is all sociology. But it's a constructive, different way to live. It's against because the world doesn't live that way. But it isn't acultural or uncultural or anti-cultural. And that therefore throws light on the choices we have to make in our time in the midst of patience and relativism and plurality, so that we would prefer those elements in our cultural options that are in favor of the dignity of persons and against enslaving people and against dealing with people as enemies, etc.
What kind of a picture would you draw if someone wanted to do what you said and live somewhere and do it? Where would the person live?
Well, if they wanted to find an ideal place to do it, there would be some value in going to a place that is relatively freer to give room for experimentation. But I'd rather not concentrate on that answer. I'd rather say that if you're going to do this, you ought to start doing it where you are. And there is, in principle, no place that you can't do this. There are places you can't do this. You can't do this unless you had a Constantine to put your theologians in charge of society. And you can't do this unless you're after this, because this depends on this in the history of culture. You can only have a Luther after you can have a Constantinian culture. So these models are only possible when Christians dominate a culture. This model is possible when Christians are in a minority. But if they get to be a large minority or have leadership power, then they can start doing this also in a society where they're stronger. But in a society where they're weak, they can still do this. So this differs from that precisely in the fact that you can do this anywhere, and you can't do that anywhere. You can't do any of these things in the Soviet Union, or in Afghanistan, or in continental China, or in medieval Africa. You can only do these things in the Western world. You can only think you're doing these things in the post-Constantinian Western world. Where this you could do in the New Testament situation of Christians in the minority. You can do this in the Soviet Union today. That's what the Baptists are doing in the Soviet Union today. It's what the Jesus family are doing in China today. So this can be done anywhere. Now, what you next do anywhere is just look at all of the options you have in your social faithfulness in the light of the conviction that what Jesus calls you to do is a good, real cultural thing to do. It is not a monastery or a withdrawal or an escape, but is an alternative way to live in your society.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest misunderstanding in evangelicalism about Anabaptism, that there seems to be an understanding that you can't do that where you are. That's a serious question for people coming from our programs going into a professional context. They need to know that they can be a professional in society and hold to those sorts of things. And the question becomes, where does their support come from? And that becomes a real issue. Here they're doing that stuff, but they don't have any support. There's not this kind or that kind of a church nearby, or they're isolated or they're alone or something. It takes that kind of a flavor on where to live.
Yeah, to spell that out a little more, these positions are not distinguished by having a different ethical position. They talk about culture in a much broader sense, but what a Christian would do about war or about dealing with offenders in a society would be the same whether you're here or here. Luther had the doctrine of the vocation especially clear. It is, if you are a farmer, then what it means for you to be a moral Christian person is that you do very well farming, because that has its own autonomous value. If you're a banker, you should bank. If you're a soldier, you should be a soldier. If you're a hangman, you should be a hangman. And you get the guidance for your profession, not from Jesus, it would be silly, but from the profession. Jesus says give your money away, but you're a banker, so you don't give your money away, because the laws of banking say don't give your money away. Jesus says love your enemy, but you're a hangman, and the laws of hangman say kill him. So the autonomy of the guidance that you get, Luther credits to the creation. And the gospel tells you to love your enemies, but that's only in personal matters. Society tells you to kill your enemies, and that's a social matter, so that the profession gets its rules from the fallen world. And a Christian has to do in the world out there what the fallen world says. Whereas these people would not say you get out of the world, but they would say in the world you don't do what the fallen world asks for. So you may contribute to the maintenance of social peace, but you don't do it by killing people, either as national enemies or as civil offenders. You may help restrain civil offenders, but you don't take their life away. You may manage investments, but you don't glorify personal possession, so that you really believe that the Jesus model cuts through that fence between loving ethics and institutional ethics and enables you in the real world to do a faithful thing that's still relevant. So there would be a Christian way to be a medical doctor or an engineer rather than saying once you get into that professional world you have left your faith behind it, or your faith makes no difference.
Then there would be specific ways of living or professions that would be diametrically opposed to Christianity. In other words, you couldn't be a soldier and be a Christian.
At least, and this is where the withdrawal idea comes from, at least there would be some professional categories that would be enormously less reconcilable with the Christian faith than with others. I don't think that has to mean in a legalistic sense that it would be impossible, as there are places. I was on Cyprus, the island of Cyprus last week, and there are soldiers from several countries in Cyprus wearing blue helmets working under the United Nations whose orders are not to kill anybody, but to keep the Turks and the Greeks apart, because the island is divided since the invasion by Turkey a while past in an effort to keep the lid on until some politicians can make peace. I'm not sure a disciple of Jesus couldn't do that, but I'm sure he couldn't do what soldiering is normally about, namely preparing to be as efficient as possible in killing your enemies. And similarly, I don't see much room for Christians serving as a mafia enforcer, or or prostitute, or some of the other standard professions in our modern culture. But I'm not interested in being the kind of Puritan that knows ahead of time with great clarity that all great realms of society can't be redeemed at all. But at least some things have to be identifiable as not for Christians to do. But that's not because they're cultural, it's because they're bad culture instead of good culture.
Then doesn't that reduce bad culture to inherently personal terms?
No.
For example, soldiering.
No, I think those are all structural examples.
I would say that you would say that soldier, that you could not resolve being a soldier in its normal definition with what the Bible says. Okay, and you have someone who says, "Well, I'm filled with the Spirit. I read Scripture and I can resolve that." And see, what we have then is, both are claiming Christ as Lord.
No.
Both are claiming the Bible as maybe very relevant in their lives, and yet both are on different sides of the fences. And all of a sudden, it comes down to an inherently personal interpretation.
Well, the difference between two people may come down to a personal interpretation because the other person isn't willing to read the Bible with me, clearly.
Or the other person is saying that you're not.
No, but he's appealing to Scripture, as to the Spirit, as you said it, or to his personal tie. If he'd actually read the Jesus story with me and we'd come out with a difference, well, then we would have to say in a kind of short-range despair, we'll have to agree to disagree for now. But then what has become personal is the difference of views. It isn't the discriminating we do about the profession. Because when I distinguish between a soldier on Cyprus and a soldier with his thumb on the atomic trigger, that's an institutional difference. That's culture as principalities and powers, and as structures. And
Churches,
the other cases,
churches fall into that then too? Because churches would fall on both sides of it.
Yeah.
Then it would be.
Well, since the Reformation, the unity of the church has been lost because of our inability to solve those questions with any integrity, so churches are in the same box as individuals. And Niebuhr is right on the level of church politics. We can't unify the church today on one position, so we have to have ecumenically some kind of recognition for all of the dispositions as being held by people. That's different from saying they're true. That just means they're tolerable, or that we can converse with. In that sense, we all have to be pluralists. But he says all the answers are right, and I have to say all the answers are not right.
Or all the answers can be held in paradox. Yeah.
Well, he might use that language, but I think his meaning of that language is that all the answers are ultimately right because we need the various sides, even if they're logically contradictory, they all belong to the picture. And I would also say they're held in paradox in that you must be wrong, yet I have to treat you as a brother. That's a kind of paradox too, but I don't grant that ultimately the case for all positions is equally biblical or equally true.
But there's the paradox of choosing lesser evil. Just the fact that we are in a fallen society, and sometimes the alternatives we choose from ourselves are such determined.
That's a different reasoning pattern. I don't think it's what normally is meant by paradox. And it isn't what is normally meant in these positions. Luther might say it's a it's a fallen world, and therefore anything we do is sinful, and accept doing something sinful because everything's sinful.
What do you mean in such an ontological sense as?
And so yes, the lesser evil argument is a further element of the picture we have to deal with, but I'm not sure that it will separate out so that we'll get another type from it. This position is always a lesser evil position. If I'm a Baptist in the Soviet Union, I know anything I can do is less than what I'd like. It's always a lesser evil position. But the question is whether I'll take the fact that I can never have what I like as a reason that I should commit certain sins that I can't avoid committing. And then the lesser evil argument isn't sufficient to say that those things are right. That we are in a fallen world is important and is used in Niebuhr himself as a criticism of the Catholic synthesis.
Yeah, war would be a big example. Like, being a soldier, you have your choice. I can escape responsibility that, in a sense, I indirectly gave myself to be a citizen, and in a sense, I should protect these people that are close to me. In another sense, I don't take up a gun because I want to love my neighbor. I'm in a sense laying down my responsibility to maybe protect people I love and uphold my
Now that's an argument for the sword. Again, it would have different meanings depending on which of these people would use it. These people also want to defend their neighbors. The real question is whether you believe that your near neighbors are more worthy of your protection than your far neighbors. And that happens to be something to which Jesus speaks. And Luther would disagree with Jesus. But it is I agree certainly to the logic that there is a trade-off. And if you follow Jesus, there are some other things that you're going to suffer. Jesus knew that. And one of them is you can't defend your friends very well against your enemies. You love your enemies. And Jesus said that's the way God is, so that's the way we better be. If we decide we're not going to be that way, then we can make lesser evil calculations, and sometimes it will be the duty of some people to cover the bad guys for the sake of the good guys. That's an understandable pattern of society. And if you don't agree with me that Jesus speaks to that, then you're free to figure it out on your own. And that kind of freedom Niebuhr would want to have. Although Richard Niebuhr was much less accepting than his brother Reinhold was of American military postures, both in the 30s and in the 50s. But yes, that is a line of argument. And the place it comes in is that it has decided my calculation of my duties as citizen to defend my nation and my close neighbors against the rest of humanity, or those forces in the rest of humanity who threaten us, is itself a cultural value, which is greater for me than the life of the enemy, of the enemies. Where that cultural value came from, that is a good specimen of what Niebuhr calls culture. It's an idea that's there. It makes sense, kind of common sense-ish. Who could be against it? But if you look at it closer, know why it should be right, why it should be my Christian duty, and who it was that gave me the duties to be that kind of citizen that will defend people of my culture against people of competitive cultures, well, then you discover that that was just kind of taken for granted. It hadn't been demonstrated. It hadn't been derived from Jesus. It had been kind of percolating out of the situation, and we just accepted it as the givenness of our situation, and Christ didn't transform it. So it's there, and I respect enormously the cultural nobility of people who see things with that position. It's just that Jesus does have to transform that commonsensical assumption for me.
For example, one thing that I've heard, a real good argument would be, a Presbyterian minister put this one up to me when we talked about, we batted this thing around nonviolence and violence. He said then we can either see it by killing by commission or omission. Either by commission by pulling the trigger, or omission by letting my brother next to me die. Be either Christian near neighbor or far neighbor. So either way, in a sense, we're killing either by not being nonviolent or violent.
There may be cases where that's the case. I don't think that's a fair representation of the nature of the arms race, or of most wars in the past, that it was actually the case that anybody, or many people, seriously had to choose between my killing him and his killing her. But that is a prototype. That is a standard way of setting the thing up in a simple form that does have to be debated with, even though it's not representative of the nature of war. And I would have to say that if I am, as Jesus expected his disciples to be in the first generation, in a minority situation, then there are evils that we let happen, and therefore we commit them by omission, because we have no accessible way to prevent them we let them happen by omission, so that because we can't commit anything to stop them. The Jesus stance in society does not assume social control. That argument does assume social control. It assumes that if I act, I will make the world go the right direction. If I don't act, somebody else will make the world go the wrong direction. That choice is only a choice we're having.
Well, I think most of you met Dr. Yoder. You could see him from the front this morning. Now you have a chance to really talk with him during this hour. And I was discussing with him what we've been reading in this semester. We have a couple of visitors. But I would like to say, you students have your questions, and you ask. And if you let it die, I have a couple. But let's just get to know him, and he will have a lot of things to say to us, and we can return. Maybe you'd like to tell, Priscilla tells me that you just came back from a lecture tour.
I was in Europe for 3 weeks, some of it lectures, some of it study consultations. One thing I'm reminded of, I was together with a black African, a professor of religious studies from Ghana, who once traveled around South Africa, the Republic of South Africa, which very seldom gives a visa to a black person, and a lecture invitation for which he was let in. And everywhere he went, he noticed the same person. It turned out he was being followed by the secret police. And everywhere I go, there's the same person in a white smock. Camera. So I guess you are a well-organized society like South Africa.
Okay, I wonder who would like to begin. They were wondering, you are teaching in Elkhart now.
I'm teaching in two institutions. I'm 2/3 in Notre Dame, which in addition to a football team does have a theology program, teaching in both ethics and church history. And in the Mennonite Seminary, which is at Elkhart, Indiana, 17 miles on the other side of Notre Dame. Elkhart is the world capital of mobile homes and Alka-Seltzer.
So, fire away. I could ask them, what about this common retort? The poor you have with you all.
I hadn't noticed it as much before, but it was actually in the text from Deuteronomy that I read. There always will be poor people. That's why we always need to be helping. It's the commitment of either the social legislation of Deuteronomy or the teaching of Jesus in favor of the poor doesn't mean that if we just work hard enough, we'll turn a corner and poverty will no longer be a problem. There's much more realism. There will always be in the world people who can't meet their own needs. And some societies, it's because they could, but they're discriminated against. And you do away with that discrimination, then those people can. But in any society, there will be some people who can't ever meet their own needs. Biblical categories are widows and orphans, and outsiders and the sick. So there will always be some categories of poor whose being poor, someone else will have to take care of because they can't. If the reason to care for the poor were the idea that we do away with need, then that argument to the poor would be a reason for not caring so much. But in the Testament, or in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy, it's the other way around. Because there will always be poor, there must always be an ethic that cares for them. When Jesus used that phrase, it wasn't against caring for the poor, it was defending a person who had expressed a special gesture of esteem for him. He used it as a defense against Judas, who didn't really want the money to go to the poor, but just said that in order to keep it from being wasted on celebrating Jesus. And that point is also worth making, that there are things that are valuable to do in
tradition to just be basic human beings. But Jesus certainly didn't mean it as saying that therefore you shouldn't care about the poor. That really means the opposite. You will always have a division of authority.
We were wondering if you had any examples of what we could do just as a college community for the poor besides like pray. Because all of us, none of us we're all trying to get through school and pay for things. Besides money and prayer, what can we do as a community?
I made the point in the chapel talk of not trying to answer those questions because it has often been the case that we would cut off the critique of the gospel and not let it really get a hold of us, because you can always say, what should we do? And then they say, well, do this. And then you say, well, if I do that, that will be enough. So you divert. The danger is that you divert looking for real answers or even committing yourself to know that you need answers by shooting down the first answers that somebody else came up with. So I don't want to come up with answers that will be simple for a question that is complicated and can't be solved soon. And that's my reason in chapel for only looking at the biblical mandate. And that biblical mandate is true whether we figured out a way to be faithful to it or not. There may be some times and places where you can't do anything right now that will solve any problem on a global level. One thing that ought to be minimally possible in an institution of education is that we include in our educational responsibility understanding the phenomenon of poverty on the world scale. This means some notion of economics, how the world works and how multinational corporations work, and why it is that the wealthy part of the world keeps getting richer and the poor part of the world keeps getting poorer. We can't all be expert economists, but we can all come to some sense of that fact that we are profiting from a system. We aren't just profiting from the fact that our parents worked hard, or that the American economy is more productive. We're profiting from a system that works for us and against others. And that's a matter of education. You're going to school, and that's a matter you can study. It applies to the American economy, which also the poor are getting poorer, the rich are getting richer, as well as it applies to the world economy. So one element is making that part of our educational agenda. And if you're in an educational track that includes those human values, take this concern with you to class. And it fits in most classes somewhere. I suppose you're going to be reading Solzhenitsyn. That's one example of deep social issues which are right in the midst of your literature. And you could also be watching the rest of the European scene. The Hitler phenomenon was part of the background of the literature you're reading. Or you can watch the contemporary scene. Peace marches going across Germany and Europe right now as a part of Europe's response to the way America treats Europe. So education in the deep sense of the gospel's impact or the gospel perspective on what's going on in the real world, whether it be poverty or war, that would be one set of things. Another would be give up on the idea, or don't look for the idea of finding the one right heroic thing that I could do. I will send $10 a month to World Vision. That will be it. Feed the hungry somewhere. Or any one expression for myself. But rather that we be committed to being part of the Christian community and searching these matters together. And instead of wanting a small answer for me quick, look for a big answer for all Christians with some time and some struggle. So look in a home church, what that congregation is doing about poverty in that town. Or if one has social relations to Christian professionals, what are they doing about what their profession does to the economic needs of people around the world? I'd pay more attention to keeping this matter in mind as you go through life, and less to finding a better thing to do with $1 tomorrow. Especially as people in your generation, you're looking forward to the use you're going to make of the rest of your life. It's more important just to keep this factor in there and not be only concerned about the dollars you have now, but about the future. You're going to make an impact on the world.
continuing to profit from the fact that you're in a culture where you're beneficiaries and somebody else is poor? Or are you going to look for ways or find ways to be on the other side of that balance?
What we came up with, it sounds pretty much like the way we thought just be to be more satisfied with a lesser lifestyle instead of.
One good starting point is just within the present choices, a more modest lifestyle. Not so much that if you live on 10% less, that therefore that'll be good enough, because you're still better off than anybody else in the world. But that is the beginning of the educational process I talked about. You begin asking yourself, how much do you really need? Do you really need this? Is this really contributing to making you a better human, or is it waste? Or is it mal-education even? We were eating lunch with a few people from the faculty. We sit in the pub where there are 4 electronic game machines, of which I was told that the campus student government is going to make $10,000 this year as their cut of something like $30,000 students on this campus are going to spend on those machines. Well, that's a good symbol. Maybe it's only a symbol, but it's a symbol of our entertainment culture and the freedom that we have to waste that much money on something which only valued as it passes the time for you or develops the skill at playing machines. That's not a very deep sin. It doesn't kill anybody. But it fails to educate us about the ultimate priorities in the most important things to do with our skills. So that's a specimen of style that's right in the middle of where we are. Our media-oriented culture and our sports competition-oriented culture. There are plenty of places where just being conscious that this is a question is already a step forward in our education.
You mentioned today that when Jesus gave the command or the words to the rich young ruler, that he knew that even if the ruler did give all his money to the poor, eventually it wouldn't have that much of an impact. So many times when I look at the hunger situations and like that, I always ask, how much of an impact would what I have, be? Well, are you perhaps saying that it's not so much the consequences of our act that make our act a virtuous or a right act, but as much as the reason that we do something, the actual motivation for it?
I don't want to choose yes or no simply that way, but yes, there's a value to making the point that way. That if we make our decisions on the basis of how the world will come out, if I do this, the machine will run that way, and if I do this other thing, the machine will run that way. We give ourselves an impression of sovereignty, of being in charge of world history. So that if I do this, world history will turn out well, and if I do that, world history will not turn out well. That itself is an unrealistic understanding of how much I have in my hands. So to act so that the world will come out better than if you acted otherwise is an unrealistically proud sense of how much what you do matters. We should rather act as if it were the case that the world is ultimately going to go God's way, and which is his way, and then we go that way, whether the rest of the world is ready for it or not, whether we'll have an impact or not. I wouldn't quite say it's only motivation, to use your phrase, meaning well. It's rather whether we are ultimately on the right side. And the right side is defined by Jesus and the prophets, not by immediate success. But that doesn't mean, this is why I started out here, it doesn't mean that we wouldn't consider the impact when we can. The impact of that one young man joining Jesus and giving away a certain number of thousands of talents wouldn't have done away with poverty in Palestine. But the impact of the pattern of people who followed Jesus sharing their money, when they came with Pentecost to be 3,000 and 5,000, began to change the culture of Palestine in such a way that what it meant to be poor was different from what it meant to be poor before. So in that sense, we have to measure impact in different ways, not just where my dollars would go if I gave my dollars away, but where a movement would go if I were part of a movement. And then we can ask impact questions after all in a longer range.
You talked about a lot about sharing, about abundance, meeting someone else's poverty. And in Acts, it talks about them living in community, having all things in common. And then you mentioned avoidance. Something we read something and we bring something to avoid the implication of that. And the thing that I always run into with communities that they say the Jerusalem experiment failed. And so community sharing isn't an option. Do you see community as something very relevant for Christians today? In living, I'm thinking of living in community and sharing in that way.
I think relevant is a good adjective in that it's not the same as obligatory. It's one way to do it that has some specific values. I don't read anywhere in the story of Acts that the author of the story, we assume it was Luke, thought it had failed. He seems to be reporting it as a success. The idea that it failed is a later critical reading of that history, which measures it by some other standards than what's in the text. The book of Acts also records that other Christians didn't have community. So it doesn't say that it's the only model. In Antioch or in the places that Paul landed where he started churches, it's never reported that they all set up communities. So the Jerusalem community was responding to a special set of circumstances, including an especially large number of widows and other things that were part of their picture. And even Jerusalem, it wasn't said that everybody gave everything away. In fact, Ananias and Sapphira were specifically told when they lied to the church about their gift that they didn't have to give it. So first, the Jerusalem community model is a dramatic, symbolic ideal for Luke, and I think it still is. But it wasn't for Luke a rule, and it didn't fail. And when the Apostle Paul and his missionary churches had a different pattern of sharing, he still called it community. And he took up collections in Corinth and Thessalonica and all those other places to take the money back to Jerusalem to be experiencing community between churches. So there is no model, no record anywhere in the New Testament of Christians who didn't share. But sharing doesn't have to be a common. Once you said that, then there is no basis for the notion that it failed, which is really just a defense against the idea that it's obligatory, which it isn't either. It's one fitting example, an especially fitting example to make some points. It's not a giveness as a law, or as something that would apply everywhere. But neither is it ever indicated that it failed to do what it was supposed to do. It was a community consumption. It wasn't trying to be maintain an economy. The many widows, that just means that it was a retirement community. It had to live off the charity of other people, just as retirement communities do in our society.
What you say, though, the whole focus on poor people and poor nations is a very limited view of ethics, in the sense that, like Cider, his whole thrust of his book is the consciousness awakening of poor people. But you mentioned earlier in your lecture in the gym that the body of Christ has many different gifts, that people exercise different gifts. So to focus or to have a thrust aimed at poor people would be, in a sense, a limit, an ethical limit, when actually that is only one path one should take. Like, as Cider mentions the Hearns as an example of a person having a consciousness of poor people.
Well, it's certainly a limitation in that it's not everything that ought to be talked about. But I don't know that the concept saying that something's limited doesn't make it less true, unless you come up with a circumstance in which it would be false. Then it's of limited truth, rather than just being one of many issues. Certainly it's only one of many issues. But I don't think there is grounds for saying that therefore it's only half the truth, and the other half of the truth is that we should all be rich. Or that economics doesn't matter in the gospel. There are other elements that we have to deal with. have a sense if you're using the word limited with more than one level. First you say it's not the only subject, which I agree with. And then you kind of suggest that maybe it's not the only truth. Well, I agree with that. And then you maybe suggest that it's also half false. And then I don't follow you. That the God of the Bible is biased for the poor, period. That's not half true, that's all true. He also loves his enemies, that's another point. So there are more things to say, but that doesn't make this first thing that I said false. And I don't think it means in our society, which is especially a society of wealth, more than ever in world history, that we wouldn't have to give this one special attention. Just as if we were living in a society where the main social activity was prostitution, we'd have to give that special attention. So I agree that it's limited, but I don't agree that it's being limited in its breadth of agenda is an argument against it.
Maybe to switch the emphasis a little bit from community to more personal, spiritual level. At least for me, that's what I'm involved in right now. You've taken sort of a stand back, wait and see. Don't commit yourself now because you might be limiting yourself view, community issues. And yet I see and encounter all around me here on a personal spiritual level, it's got to be here, it's got to be now, it's got to be today. You can't put this off. You think it's also appropriate without being lazy or trying to be comfortable to maybe take the view, I'd better wait on this, further enlightenment is coming. Any issue that you might be dealing with spiritually?
I'm not quite sure that I said as much about waiting as you play back. The fact that I, as an outsider, concentrate on biblical imperatives rather than on practice, and that I say everybody will have to figure it out themselves, and people who see themselves as the middle of education will have to put it as their educational goal and not something that's out today. It doesn't mean that I would be against as much decisiveness as I'm fine for now. So I don't think I want to be arguing in favor of what you suggest, that for matters of moral accountability, you wait till later for matters of spiritual decision you rather have to decide right now. I'd rather want to link them more closely, but that might mean, to come back to your other question, that there would be some elements of what people ordinarily talk about when they talk about making a decision for Christ or turning their life over or deepening their commitment, where I'd ask, do you know what this means concretely when you use these big words? And is the decision that you're talking about that is so decisive right now, is it one that carries through time and you know what difference it's going to make, or is it just an emotional high, or is it just a psychological manipulation that you happen to be ready for because of the time? So I guess I would ask some questions about longitude in spiritual matters, just as I do in economic matters. I wouldn't want to play the two against each other, as if spiritual matters could be decided today and economics only gradually. But they both really call for definition as to what they mean concretely, and that definition will take time to study and to process and figuring out the situation.
Yeah, making this more personal. I'm trying to think of what I can do, and also in the body of Christ, because Paul talks about the adulterers, homosexuals are not inherit the kingdom of heaven. He talks about the greedy and the covetous in that. In the church, he talks about making the elders and bishops, about not being a greedy man. So when we talk about sharing or being accountable for the poor, he's talking to elders, how can we judge that? If we're being not responsible towards the poor, if we're being covetous or greedy towards ourselves, how do we judge that in ourselves? How do we judge that in the body of Christ?
You just have to work at it. As if if the question, how do we judge, could be answered by a very simple yardstick, that is, a Cadillac is too much, but a Oldsmobile is all right. Any such answer would be unworthy of making it a matter of deep spiritual concern and discipline. So I don't want a simple answer to that question, but I want a commitment on the part of anybody who cares to working at it. And if you work at it, and you're among people who are agreed to work at it, you will get more and more serious, and you'll get life. You'll find your way. And what's wrong is people who would say, how are you going to judge? And because they don't get a clear answer to that, then give up on making any decision. And say, well, then we'll have to leave it to every individual. And that's not an accountable thing to do, whether it's about doctrine or about obedience. There isn't a simple answer to how you're going to judge it, but there's a complicated answer, namely that you walk together. And you do as Jesus said, when your brother sins, you tell him about it. And when your brother comes to you about your sin, you listen and repent. That's a process, and when that process is used, there's no problem that you can figure out when somebody's greedy. Any more than there's a problem figuring out when somebody's adulterous. It works out clear enough if you process it. The bad thing is to use an argument that says, how are you going to judge? And then hastily to say, well, you can, so we won't. So that element of faithfulness is part of our church agenda. And then you're sold out to pluralism. And then you'll never get guidance because you've decided that you don't want it. That won't be a matter of the church's identity. So it's sort of like, what does it mean to love your neighbor? We're never told what it means to love your neighbor in terms of 6 points or 12 points. We're told that you know very well what it is to love yourself. Well, treat your neighbor like that. So we're given a process definition for loving the neighbor instead of a content definition, which means that you know very well what it means to love your neighbor because you know very well what it means when you're not being loved by somebody. So in the process of relating to people, you'll find a way to know what it means to be loving your neighbor. You'll find what it means to be greedy. You'll find what it means to be domineering. It's a red herring. It distracts us from the problem. To ask what the standards would be for an automatic trip instead of entering into the process of a continuing accountability.
How do we view a God who on one hand seems to endorse or, the rich splendor of Solomon and all his glory, and who on the other hand says to us we should sell all our goods and poor? I mean, is there a role for such extreme wealth that we can build, cathedrals and, supposedly to the glory of God or that yet, leave everything to the poor? You see what the paradox there?
Well, I don't want to be so ethnocentric, but from my perspective, I would condemn completely other cultures in which it may be that even the poor people were glad to see some gold in the church. If that was the case in the Middle Ages when they decorated their cathedrals. Maybe that was valid in some sense, that poor people would rather have a glorious cathedral in which to have ceremonies than have their share of that much money back home. If that was the case, then maybe that is valid. But I don't think the Scripture ever glorifies the Solomon story as a model for always and ever. There is David language. Jesus is to be a new David in some sense, but there's never a promise to be another Solomon. So the Solomon story is given us as a sign of how wise and triumphant a person can be, but it's not portrayed as a model. Even in the narratives where it happens, it collapses soon. It's much more possible to argue in the Bible that Solomon failed than that Jerusalem failed. Because what the Solomon was set up, it was to doomed to defeat as soon as his son tried to make it work for another generation. Spoken in the story of maintaining the kingdom. And then the book of Deuteronomy has a set of rules for what a king should be if you have a king, and describes him in specific ways that condemn Solomon. So we have the structure from within Scripture to be, at least to relativize the thing of Solomon. It's not a monster, and not the greatest thing that God ever wanted to have happen. We can say that, I think, more about Solomon and about the wars of the Old Testament, which are more of a problem, but also from a gospel perspective, I think we have an answer. So I still have some openness to cultures in which people would want to waste some of their money rather than being good stewards, if that's part of their culture. Because in a Latin American culture, people would rather have parties than solid buildings, because in Central America, you don't heat your house anyway. So I'm open to some cultural differences in exactly how rich and poor look, and what are the expressions of being rich and poor. But I don't think there's any inconsistency in the picture of God, who really wants to be praised by our sharing with the neighbors and not by having gold candlesticks lit for it. The thrust of the prophets against ceremonial liturgy and worship is pretty strong. Nothing in the New Testament can change that. And the evangelical impact since the Middle Ages has always been to set aside that kind of thing. Because it's bad worship, not only because it's bad economics. So in that sense, the God of cathedrals is not quite the God of the gospel. That doesn't mean it isn't interesting to understand the elements of faith and Christian worldview that enter into the cathedral culture, and there are some valuable elements of Christian cultural witness to be seen in understanding what they were doing when they built those buildings. But I don't think they counted as a case for wealth any more than against democracy, because the people that built the cathedrals were kings.
I was wondering if you saw some danger in emphasizing the poor to the extent to which we feel guilty about any consumption that we have once a month.
It's a possibility that preoccupation with things you can't help, whether it be starvation in Calcutta or other things, might cripple us and not really be helpful even to the people we want to help. That's always a possibility. In other realms as well. A fear of sexual sins may keep people from having friends of the other sex. A fear of communism can keep people from looking at the problems of the American economy. So it's always possible to be narrow for the wrong, fearful reasons, and I'd recognize that here too. And it's possible, especially with concentration not on poverty as usual, but on dramatic forms of it, like Calcutta and refugees, like some of the pictures in the slides this morning. It is possible to feel so bad that the bad feeling doesn't help anybody, and it may actually immobilize. But it's just as unwise to avoid looking those truths in the face on the grounds that you're afraid of putting guilt trips on people. And that's a special sickness of our society. We're so afraid of guilt. The one thing we don't want to be guilty of is making anybody feel guilty. But we are guilty. So a certain amount of awareness of guilt is part of being human and mature. And if we dodge the fact that we are profiting from a world culture in which some other people keep being the victims, then our avoidance of the drama and the trauma of that guilt is really not wanting to face facts. So we need some awareness of it, and some feeling of guilt, not just objective awareness of the mess. Otherwise, we'll never work at it. So I agree with the observation, but the observation can very easily be taken too far. People will say, well, let's not put quick guilt trips on anybody, so let's not look at anything bad. And then that becomes a wrong kind of defense.
Would you say there's a gradual desensitizing when you see those lines? Okay, you see this line, you don't do anything. Okay, and then you go along, you see them again, and you haven't done anything. Gradually that becomes hard to do something about it. Okay, would you say that personal involvement, for instance, in Calcutta, if I feel for those people in Calcutta that I should go there personally to understand how the individuals need help. Some may need help materially, and some may need help spiritually. Would you say that's the best way to accomplish that?
Again, as with the other comment, I think it's part of the same thing. The most dramatic images of the world's need, whether it be war or starvation or other things, if we dramatize our picture of it in order to get attention, then there is this danger of being desensitized. If you raise your voice all the time, then raising your voice no longer is functional. If people normally speak at a normal tone of voice, then when somebody shouts, it matters, and you listen. But if they shout all the time, it stops mattering. And in that sense, overstatement of anything or dramatic statement of anything is counterproductive in the long run because people get hardened to it, defensive. And that's a special problem with the American media, where we're always over-inputted, and everything's advertising for our attention, and everything else is shouting. So if these calls to come shout, they won't be heard. That's a special further part of the mess we're in. That the real deep needs of our society don't have advertising agencies working for them, and don't have the most dramatic communication that they're supposed to. So we have to correct for that by finding our own ways to care. You're certainly right that any kind of involvement helps. Flying to Calcutta in order to go slumming for 2 weeks wouldn't be the best way, though. There are more local kinds of involvement with simpler kinds of poverty. You could do something in downtown Chicago, or you could relate in a vacation period to a service context that would be much deeper in the sense you would get the drama of it. And that would be an answer to your question too about what we can do. There are places that most of us could get in touch with without going to the other end of the world, where you could see some needy people and have some picture of what it does to people who are needy. Whether it's child care or care of the aged, all kinds of service opportunities available there. Not only a chance to do some good to somebody on a modest scale, but a chance to educate yourself about culture of poverty. And that is certainly much deeper than reading about it. And it doesn't vaccinate you the way looking forward pictures does.
Then, America is a wealthy nation. Its lifestyle company that's all about. Is it possible then for an American to understand without seeing the rest of the world? And if we see it in movies, we see it through real. For instance, with the children, how do you think they come to understand the world? Seems many of us live very isolated as well.
Yeah, there are societies where the rich and the poor walk down the same streets. There are parts of the massive slums of Brazil or Mexico City where rich people and poor people are side by side. They know the other people are there, even if they can't understand what their life is like. We are much more protected than that residential segregation and transportation segregation make it possible. Not even to see the poor in our own society at any point in the ordinary growing up life of the young person of a middle-class family. And that's a real deprivation that is hard to make up for. I don't know if you can't make up for it only by reading. Certainly the media are powerful, and there are ways to compensate for some of that, following the news. And culture-critical kinds of resources that are available also in the media and journalism. But I don't think anybody growing up in America in a comfortable family will get this other element of education without wanting it. It won't force itself on you. So it means at least looking for it, selecting, maybe making vacation occupation plans or volunteer involvement plans that are beyond what the culture calls for. Because our culture was set up to protect people against meeting and against personal encounter with other kinds of beings. It happens without much choice on our own part. We were living in the part of our small town that was just the edge of the Black Ghetto. So all of our children went to schools on the edge of the ghetto. And have been grateful ever since. They didn't have to learn about the race problem or about the poverty problem in a college class. And were much more able to ride with what you learn when you see the real world than people who just never knew there was such a thing as racial tension, or that there are people who can't make it. So that does happen. It's called for compensation, and it doesn't come as part of our normal education. And maybe do some of that through reading some of this tragic literature that you're reading. If you see it as an effort to get at the real world and not just spinning fantasy.
Aren't your children involved? I heard your children were involved in like the poor countries working in those countries.
Well, I was just speaking to the fact of not regretting that they didn't grow up in a comfortable, all-white community. I'm not sure that the appropriateness of that would have to be proved by their all becoming missionaries later. And they won't. But my eldest daughter did voluntarily work for 3 years in a bilingual education program to help Puerto Rican and Chicano children. Otherwise, they were getting poor treatment in the school system. Second daughter just finished medical school. Son is studying engineering and has decided to do agricultural engineering because he sees that as making more sense than mechanical engineering. It would be the world power, world hunger. Third daughter's in Egypt right now, trying to figure out something to do about peacemaking in the Near East with a degree in international relations. Fourth daughter's in China. That has nothing to do with world poverty. Yeah. Although we've had the privilege of being in touch with other world cultures, and that makes it easier for young people to make their choices to the rest of the world where we go.
How many cultures have you been able to, you've lived in many places?
Well, the experiences that would relate to this, I think, have only really been three. One is growing up in an American mixed neighborhood, where the only mixed economy was blacks. We didn't have other minority groups. 1 year in South America, and 1 year in Israel. In Israel, you had to do a sheriff thing on two sides of the same street. And all three of those places are sensitized and received a place of domination and class discrimination and race discrimination as a part of daily life and how that hurts people. So that was a privileged way to become realistic about this.
Are you encouraged that more Christians are thinking, considering that they are responsible and that they should consider the poor as you travel? Are you encouraged?
I don't know, because I don't know how deeply it is true. Brown-sided book is sold well, but how well does a book have to sell for you to know that it's making a real difference? Billy Graham has decided that he's against the arms race. He wouldn't have said 10 years before. But how many spokespeople like that, making general decisions like that, visit tape to define a trend? I'm not a journalist or a statistician, and I don't travel much in grassroots contexts or places where one can do statistical study. I do have the impression that there is somewhat more attention given to these matters in evangelical circles than before. But whether it's enough more to catch up with how far behind everybody was, and to catch up with the speed at which the world is getting worse, I don't know. So there are steps in the right direction. Whether they're enough, they're big enough, they're fast enough, or deep enough, I don't have the tools that they have.
I'd like to welcome all of you to the last day of Madsen lectureship. I'd like to welcome all of you to the last day of the Madsen lectureship. Would you bow your heads in prayer with me? Father in heaven, we lift before you Dr. Yoder, asking that you speak to us through his words. May what is said here be to your glory. Open our minds, Lord, to hear truths which might be uncomfortable, which might be new to us. At the same time, give us the gift of discernment. Each of us has many gifts to use in your service. Don't let us hold any of them back because of old customs, misbeliefs, or the pressures of society. Teach us to love and know one another as persons created in your image, rather than roles determined by the world. Be in this room, Lord God, in what is said and in what is learned. Because of Jesus we pray. Amen. Mr. Lettinger will come and introduce our speaker.
It was 1973. My jeans were torn. My hair was about this long. I'd gradually become more and more of a radical and less of a Christian. And I wandered into this radical bookstore and ran across John Howard Yoder's The Politics of Jesus. Made me realize that it was radical to be a Christian. It was a rather eye-opening experience. Now I know that some of you find John Howard Yoder's rigorous academic style almost too dense, almost too cerebral, too challenging to make comfortable chapel listening. But his academic credibility is what makes his insights, what makes his propositions mind-stretching, prophetic, and maybe even essential to Christians now in our global community. Dr. John Howard Yoder.
The topic for this morning is, what kind of feminist was Jesus? There are two ways to go about connecting the teachings of the Bible and our contemporary agenda. We can take the thoughts and the debates and the slogans of our time and then go to see in the Bible or in the history of Christian thought what kind of support there is for this or that modern position. If we did it that way, there would be two kinds of feminism, simplifying of course.
that we could take from our time and carry back to the ancient texts to see if they have anything to say about it. There is the kind of feminism that could be called political and egalitarian, which accentuates the need to downplay differences, which says that women and men are the same in all essential qualities except those which are biologically related to reproduction, so that with regard to the skills they can learn, the functions they can carry out in society, the differences that are imposed between men and women are the product of culture and ought to be critiqued and reviewed and dismantled. And then there is the cultural or complementarian kind of feminism, which says that there are specific qualities in which each of the sexes naturally should excel, and that there are certain feminine qualities which ought to be given more space in our society, certain qualities of insight, tenderness, and intuition, that we should appreciate the differences rather than denying them, and then give more room than our society does for the virtues of a feminine cultural quality in a society which is too tough and too macho and too tyrannical. We could take either of these and go back to the Bible to look for support or for critique. But what I'm going to do is something simpler, starting from the other end. Simply a descriptive study of what we have in the New Testament texts to know in his own society what kind of feminist Jesus was. That is, in what way the dignity of women was for Jesus important. And then the connection to these modern themes will be for us to make, for anybody to make any time later. Jesus came into a society which was discriminatory on the basis of sex. It was not only a matter of custom that women had fewer possibilities, fewer rights, fewer openings to grow and to function socially. There was explicit rabbinic teaching as far as the Jewish tradition was concerned. Women did not study the law, with the word law meaning the entire concern for the knowledge of God. They were not required to pray the way men were required to pray. They were not free to talk in public to any man but that particular woman's husband or father. They were subject to regulations regarding polygamy and divorce, which were discriminatory, and in other ways that scholars have no difficulty clarifying. The status of women in the society around Jesus was clearly defined as inferior. The first level on which we find Jesus blazing a trail, taking a different line of activity, is the simple fact that he sometimes disregarded distinctions. That is, he did not respect the rules according to which the inferiority of women was presupposed. One of the most striking specimens of this, which we'll look at more than once, is in John's Gospel, 4th chapter. Jesus is in the province of Samaria, that part of Palestine that was less Jewish than the rest. He is resting beside a well, and a woman from that town comes to draw water. You know the story. At the end of that conversation, the disciples had been off on an errand. Just then his disciples came. They marveled that he was talking with a woman. That very fact. even his disciples, were struck by the fact it was not a normal thing to be doing, to be dealing person to person, one man and one woman in a conversation as if she were a real person and mattered to him as much as a man would have asking similar questions. A second place where we see a specific role assigned to women in relation to Jesus, and this is a statement we do not find very often, but it occurs in an important place, a description in Luke's Gospel, chapter 8, of the way Jesus was traveling around with his company of disciples. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means. So we have some women whom he had healed in special ways, and some women who had money. And this company of women was part of the company of disciples. So it wasn't just Jesus and the 12, a stag hiking party, talking theology all the time. It was a mixed community, traveling with housekeepers and with the kind of social relationships that must have been literally shocking to the polite society of the time. There are other references to the women who traveled with Jesus and his disciples and ministered to them. In fact, women are called ministers in this context in Mark 15 and Matthew 27. Ministers in the literal sense of servants. The other story, also in Luke's Gospel, that has more weight than we have sometimes learned to give it, has to do with the family to which Jesus seems to have had a special social attachment. 2 sisters and a brother, that we have Jesus most often reported as dealing with the sisters, Mary and Martha. Martha was doing the housekeeping. Mary was sitting at the Lord's feet and listening to his teaching. That is, she was studying theology. Sitting at the feet of a rabbi was the technical word for being a pupil. Jesus answers Martha when she complains. Mary has chosen the good portion. The word good portion in the Jewish language of the time was a description of the vocation of the rabbi, the particular slot in society and the particular set of occupations that have to do with studying the Word of God. So it is reported within the ministry of Jesus that he supported and accepted and authorized and even protected, in this case, the access of women to studying the Scriptures and the law, something that was not permitted by the rabbinic tradition. So there we see 3 specimens of women having a place in Jesus' surroundings that did not accept the limitations of the rules of the time. We can go beyond this and observe more than I'll list in the number of cases here, specific women that had a special status in the whole story of Jesus. These 2 sisters, Mary and Martha, and their brother Lazarus, have a special place in his life. We see it in the story of the death and resurrection of Lazarus as well. The only person to whom Jesus is recorded as speaking about the resurrection, before the resurrection, is his conversation with Mary and Martha in John 11, just before the raising of Lazarus. The only person to whom Jesus is reported as talking about himself as Messiah, before the confession of Peter,
is the woman at the well. Women are present at his crucifixion, whereas we know of only one man among his disciples to be present there. Women are present at his burial. No woman denied him, as numerous of his male disciples did. Women are the first to come to the empty tomb, the first to be witnesses to the resurrection, the first to see Jesus resurrected, and the first to carry that witness to other people. Now, the witness of Mary, when she went back to the 12 to say she had seen the risen Lord, was not listened to because women didn't have, in Jewish society, the right to be witnesses in court or in establishing the truth of the matter. But it was women who did first witness to the resurrection. So those are some obvious, modest, but important elements of Jesus dealing with women without reference to the way in which his society said they should be dealt with. But now we move to another level, somewhat more complex and delicate and difficult to get a hold of, and still more profoundly important. Jesus reached beyond equal treatment and favored women, not just vaguely or generally or selectively, but he dealt with women at the point where being a woman was a disadvantage. He affirmed the dignity of women at the point where women were victims because of their being women, and even because of their being irregular in what had happened to them as women. We begin by going back to the woman at the well in Samaria. He tells her, she wonders how he knew, that she had been married 5 times and is now living with a man to whom she is not married. Our straight Puritan response to that is to say, what an awful woman she must have been. Jesus didn't say that because she wasn't. It wasn't her choice. She was the victim of 5 men who had taken her and left her, and another who had taken her without due process. The woman had no choice in the matter. And Jesus does not hold against her that she has been, in this dramatic way, the victim of male abuse in Samaritan society, but lets her be a genuine person in his eyes, despite the way society had treated her and the way society treats someone whom it has treated that way. Then we have, again it's in Luke's Gospel, chapter 7, the report of Jesus being the guest in the home of a very respectable person, a Pharisee named Simon. A woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was sitting at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, wiped them with the hair of her head, kissed his feet, anointed them with the ointment. His host said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. Jesus understands what Simon is thinking about, converses with him about forgiveness, about great forgiveness and small forgiveness, speaks to the woman a word of forgiveness, and defends her against her accuser. Not by saying she's not a sinner, but by saying that her sin is forgiven and that her knowledge of her being forgiven is more profound than any understanding of the gospel that Simon is ready for. A woman of bad reputation, with the strong physical symbolism of perfume and letting one's hair down in public and touching a man's body, all of those
sexual symbolism that shouldn't happen in public, all of them accepted by Jesus as the dramatizing of his reconciliation reaching into the status of that rejected woman. The other case is the very well-known one in chapter 8 of John's Gospel. A woman is brought before Jesus with the thought that he should be challenged, as a rabbi could be challenged, to judge whether she ought to be stoned, because back in the books of Moses, the death penalty was prescribed for adultery, and she had been caught in the act. It wasn't so much that they wanted the woman destroyed, they wanted to put Jesus to a test that would be embarrassing. Again, as sexist as we are as well, we tend to assume that this was a bad woman, and worse than other women, and that it was her fault. If we knew a little more about Palestinian society at the time, we'd know that that event of adultery was probably more the man's initiative than hers. And the nature of the case being such that you can't take a woman in adultery without catching the man too. There's something very strange and unjust and selective about the fact that they want the woman to be stoned and not the man. Again, Jesus responds not by saying adultery is all right, not even by saying that the law according to which adulterers ought to be stoned is not there in the books of Moses, but by taking the accusers as persons to task for their vindictiveness and their sinfulness and their guilt and their not granting that they themselves are sinners. And he saves the woman from her legally possible fate. He saves himself as well from being caught in the pincers of this particular logical trap. He doesn't speak against the law of Moses. He saves her life and frees her to sin no more. So 3 times we find Jesus freeing a woman from the indignity of being rejected by society because of sexual impropriety, and dealing with that kind of woman as if she were still a person with human dignity, and applying specifically to her a message of forgiveness that the men aren't ready for, that the men don't know they need. Now turn to one more story in this, back in the 8th chapter of Luke's Gospel again. This time I'll read a little more of it. There came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue. Falling at Jesus' feet, he besought him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. As he went, the people pressed round him. A woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years and could not be healed by anyone came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her flow of blood ceased. Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" All denied it. Peter said, "Master, the multitudes surround you and press upon you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone forth from me." And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." While he was still speaking, a man from the ruler's house came and said, "Your daughter is dead, so do not trouble the teacher anymore." But Jesus, on hearing this, answered him, "Do not fear, only believe, and she shall be well." When he came to the house, he permitted no one to enter with him, except Peter and John and James and the father and mother of the child. All were weeping, bewailing her. He said, "Do not weep, she is not dead but sleeping." They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. Taking her by the hand, he called, saying, "Child, arise." The woman on the way, in the middle of this double story, was suffering from infirmity, which made her untouchable. If her family obeyed the rules, she had not touched anybody in her family for those 12 years because she was impure. Or else the family needed her services, or her husband still had some respect for her, and they broke the law by touching her, and then the family was out of the religious community. So one way or the other, this woman's sexual ailment cut her off from society, even from her husband. And she shouldn't be touched. She was healed by Jesus' touch at her initiative. He affirmed it, he rejoiced in it, he freed her from being afraid of having done something wrong and getting so close to him. He rejoiced in her faith. If you compare the healing of the daughter of Jairus with the other times when Jesus is reported as raising people from the dead, this is the only time he touched the body of the dead person. The other two times he's reported as healing someone who was dead, it relates to women. One is reported as the son of a widow in Galilee, and Jesus just raises him with a word, and the widow gets more attention than the dead young man gets in the story. And the other case is, of course, Lazarus. And again, the sisters get more attention than Lazarus gets in the story. And Lazarus is raised by a word. Jesus says, "Come out," and the dead man rises. But Jesus touches the dead girl. He takes her by the hand. To touch a corpse is not permitted, except at the cost of uncleanliness, impurity. To touch a female corpse, a man, a female other than someone of his family, is a serious ground of impurity. And Jesus reaches over those fences to heal, as he had reached over other fences to forgive. We could go farther, but these are the most dramatic points of direct action to record. We could find in the teachings of Jesus symbolic reference to the dignity of the female as well. There are, for instance, parables where God is represented by a female person. The shepherd that seeks the sheep, the shepherd represents God. The prodigal son, the father represents God. But in that same 15th chapter of Luke, the third parable is the parable of the lost coin, where God is represented by a woman, housekeeper, a housewife who has lost a coin and seeks for it. And with more careful attention to the parables of Jesus and to some of his other kinds of teachings, one would find more places where there seems to be an explicit intent on the part of Jesus as teacher always to keep a feminine element in the picture as well. But that takes more technical and more careful reading. The last kind of thing to observe, only as a kind of footnote because I've been talking about Jesus specifically, is the prolongation in the apostolic church of some results of the feminism of Jesus. We have the report as a fact, as an event in the book of Acts, that women prophesy. And we have in the letter of Paul to the Corinthians, instructions about how women are to go about prophesying. Now, it is true that there is need for respecting the limits of culture and custom so as to avoid scandal and social disorder, so that Paul explains in terms of the customs of the time that a woman who rises in the church to prophesy shall keep her veil on. Her headgear was the specimen, the symbol of the presence of this woman in a wider society as not a disorderly person. not a person seeking to destroy propriety. There were women who, knowing that the veiling was a symbol of male protection, when they rose to speak in the church, felt so free that they'd tear off the veil to dramatize their freedom. Paul says, you don't have to dramatize your freedom. You're free to talk, to prophesy, but keep your hat on. You don't have to dramatize your liberation as long as you're living it. We have in the book of Acts, and in indirect references in the writings of Paul as well, most strikingly in one case, a woman named Prisca or Priscilla, but other cases would seem to be parallel, a woman teaching theology. In fact, it's reported of the most academically and educationally fluent person in the life of the Church of Acts, a man named Apollo, who came from the school of oratory at Alexandria, that although he was a wonderful speaker, he had to get his theology set straight by Priscilla. They taught him to understand better the meaning of the gospel. Now, because in Paul's writings there are elements of counsel that go in the direction of respecting culture and custom, some of those have been used, I would have to say misused, in later applications to make it seem as if he were against women in church ministry, women in leadership, women in vocal ministry and teaching authority. That's a misunderstanding as far as I can see. On the level of the fundamental dignity of all human persons, there is not only this kind of specimen of persons whom we actually see functioning as prophetesses and theologianesses. There is also the theory of the apostle, which says that all are now equal, that Jew and Gentile are no longer to be separated in a discriminatory way, slave and free, barbarian and civilized, male and female, in the unity of the Christian church, which is expressed by the act of baptism, in which we all deny ourselves and all rise to a new life. There is no difference between categories of people. That applies to the other category differences. It also applies to male and female. Does that say anything to our contemporary debate? I said I won't try to spell that out. I'll just suggest at one point that the depth of the way Jesus went about liberating women whom he met is more profound than considerable contemporary feminism, because it reaches into the place where in that society, and I think an anthropologist would tell us, in almost all societies, women are made to be inferior, dealt with as inferior, because of the burden of their womanhood as it relates to fertility, childbearing, blood, and death. Jesus reaches into women's being victims as they are abused in adultery. He reaches, I didn't talk about that, into their being victims as they are abused in divorce. He reaches into their being victims as it is held against them that they bear in their bodies the marks of fertility and the capacity to reproduce and the flow of blood. In all of those ways, Jesus does more than modern feminism does to strike at the root of why male-dominated societies have felt it was all right to keep women in second place. He does it through forgiveness. He doesn't say we're all created equal. We aren't. We're created different. But in forgiveness we become equal. And those to whom, as they themselves know, much has been forgiven, are also those who are able much to love. We have the reports of several of those women. And he makes them equal in the reality of the new life which baptism represents, in which the grounds for discrimination are part of what is put under the water and buried in the burial of baptism, replaced by the equality, the equity, the quality of the new life, which comes in faith in the power of God to raise us all from the dead, from the deadness of who we were before, into a newness of life in which each of us lives unto the Lord with the same dignity. It may be, if we really find our rootage in the feminism of Jesus, that we will also have some redemptive contribution to make to the struggles of our age, to find in times that relate to North American society and to world society expressions of the dignity of womanhood that will also be part of the Christian mission and part of the meeting of human need in our age. May God lead us in that direction.
A couple of things. There will be a discussion with Dr. Yoder in Johnson Lounge in about 20 minutes, 11 o'clock. And at 12 o'clock, you will be having lunch in the pub with students. Bring your own tray from upstairs or bring your own bag lunch if you're a commuter. Shall we pray? Father, may we go out and live in the equality and forgiveness and the radicality of our baptism in Christ's resurrection.